Mm, Okay.
Mm.
So, hello, thank you for joining me today here. Thank you for allowing me to interview you. So, could you give me like a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. My name is Dr. Timothy Min. I work at UCB Biosciences. I'm a medical director in global clinical research in neurology. I've been working at UCB about 4 years. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for about 10 years after I finished the MD PhD training program at the University of California, Irvine. So I know Esther through Taekwondo, and so she asked if I was willing to talk a little about my work, and so here we are.
So, to get straight into it, so I know currently, well, not currently, but the last research that I saw on your publications list was about the epilepsy clinical trials. It was probably about 2022, if I'm correct, it was published. So some questions I have about that. So clinical trials often involve the testing of a new drug, and it's often very long, very arduous, and very costly. So what is UCB's process to narrow down like a list of potentially helpful drugs to just one to put on the pedestal for testing?
Yeah, so as you know, clinical trials take a long time, but it's actually not just one drug at a time a lot of times. Um, when a company wants to pursue clinical research, they often start, depending on the size of the company, depending on how they're structured, but they start with many different candidates. So you may take um, a thousands of possible chemicals, and you see, will one of these chemicals react with something in the body? And so there's receptors in the body, so you might test it first on the computer, just like, hey, would this chemical fit um, with this receptor in the computer in simulations? Then you may move to cells, and then you go into different models, animal models, small animals, and then larger animals. And then this is all done before going into humans, because you don't want to harm patients without with some brand new drug that you never tried in any species. And so, yeah, it's a long process. There's a lot of steps, and ultimately, as you go through this, some seem to bind to the receptors more strongly. The receptors are known to act in certain ways in the body, and so the if you just look at the profile that you get through these testings, then you can decide, okay, I think we'll try this drug um, for this patient population. And so it's there's in the first part of this testing, this is the early phase or preclinical work. There might be different possibilities, different indications that the company might want to choose to test in humans. And so there could be parallel trials, but there's if the company is big enough and has enough resources, they may pursue multiple indications. They might try multiple drugs and test them in humans. So it's yes, it's there's just a lot of basic science before all the clinical research happens.
Okay. So in terms of, so at the end of the study, ultimately, like it did not prove to be statistically significant. So the drug that you tested clinically, which was Pat7, if I'm saying that correctly, and but even the result wasn't what you guys expected. There's no doubt that there was much learned from those experiences. Could you talk about some of those?
Yes, so you have an interesting question here, Pat. 7L, it was designed to be the next best epilepsy drug. There's a lot of epilepsy drugs out there. Unfortunately, not all of them work for all populations. Some work well, but not extremely well. And so PET7L was designed using rational drug design. I'm just looking at some of these properties I mentioned, just like There was some earlier testing on the molecule, and then some medicinal chemists thought, okay, let's try to tweak it a little bit. We'll do some organic chemistry to change it to a compound that binds more selectively to certain receptors. So there was a GABA receptor and SD2A. It doesn't really matter for this purposes, but it was specifically and rationally designed to bind to two receptors versus a lot of them binding to one. And so the idea was to be a revolutionary drug for the patients. When the trial was set up, because we wanted it to be such a revolutionary drug, we also set the testing barrier really high. And so when you set up a statistical test, you say, okay, what are you testing? And so in the Patsevenol trials, we wanted to have a 75% reduction in the number of seizures versus many of the other trials are testing for 50% reduction. And so unfortunately, Patsevenol didn't show a 75% reduction, but it still was working for some patients, unfortunately. And so it's kind of it's a challenge because we wanted this high threshold so that it could be approved in a certain way. The regulatory authorities, there's a whole regulatory system that's set up that you need to say, okay, I'm doing this test to try to make it available for this patient population. And so you have to set up all these parameters beforehand, and we wanted this to be like again, like the breakthrough, the revolutionary, the game changer, instead of just another drug. And so, yeah, I guess what we learned is that this drug, it has a potential to help people, but unfortunately, it wasn't a game changer. And so we decided that we couldn't, based on the regulatory network or the framework and also the business structural models, we couldn't actually pursue further testing for this drug. The company has considered trying to sell this to another company with a different business model, and there's still potential for Patsevenol to be given to patients, but at least not right now.
Oh, okay. So as part of the study on the paper, it said that it listed up some things about how COVID-19 kind of detrimentally affected the
Yeah.
study, like phase 3 of the clinical trials, I think. So how did things get more difficult because of the pandemic, and how did you guys kind of overcome this obstacle?
Yeah, so the pandemic affected everyone. It affected you, it affected me. I'm sure your school was disrupted. My work location was disrupted, and like it was interesting before the pandemic, everyone would be in the office every single day, and all the meetings as much as possible would be in person. Um, and when the pandemic came, there was just changes in just being able to see people. There was the whole social distancing. There were companies closed, so we couldn't go into the office and interact and discuss what needed to be discussed for the clinical trials in person. We were able to transition, fortunately, to remote work and continue a lot of these. But it's just changed how we interacted with each other, but also it changed how it affected things on the patient side too. So the patients, a lot of them couldn't go to the hospitals, or if they were, some of the facilities were closed, or they couldn't take as many patients, and they sometimes had to miss the planned study visit just because they couldn't see their doctors for research. Some of the patients were allowed to see some of the doctors to have a continuation of care for their like day to day, but they weren't allowed to do clinical trial work. Um, so there were disruptions there. There was also challenges with the drug supply, um, as shipping was affected, all the globalization and all the shipping industries were changed with what's or affected by COVID, um, and so it just affected a lot of people. It's interesting the FDA and the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and all these other agencies. They actually requested all the companies to keep track of how COVID affected the clinical trials. And so if there was a change to the protocols, then we'd have to record it and say this is what happened because this happened because of COVID. Did it affect things a lot or a little bit? They're called protocol deviations. So was it a major or minor protocol deviation due to COVID? And so yeah, it was just a disruption for everybody.
Do you think the study could have gone farther if it wasn't for the pandemic?
I don't think so. I mean, a lot of it was done before the major things in the, I mean, the disruptions that started before the pandemic. We were still able to adjust, but there was just some times there were, for example, if a patient had to come in on the 15th of a month and they couldn't get in until the um, the 25th or something, or like it might be outside of the planned study window, but it's like not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. So we just have to keep track of everything because there's a protocol and you're not supposed to deviate from it. Um, I think maybe it could have gone faster because some sites did close down completely. But on the most part, um, I think we were as an industry able to overcome a lot of these challenges.
Oh, okay, I see. So I completely understand if you're not allowed to talk about it, but are you currently in the process of testing a new drug? Is there any new clinical trials that are going on at UCB?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of clinical trials going on right now at UCB. There's one that I'm working on. It's a drug to stop prolonged seizures. And so some patients, despite taking medicines, they have seizures that occur frequently and they last several minutes. And so it's sometimes these seizures they keep on going because and they the patients have to call the ambulance to come and give them IV medication or some injection
Hmm.
and take them to the hospital. And so we're trying to develop a medicine right now that is able to be administered at home by the patient or by the family. And so then this medicine could stop the patient from having these prolonged seizures and then stop the need to go to the hospital. So,
So it's basically like before they can receive it from the hospital, they can
yeah,
receive.
yeah. And so that will allow the patient, if they're able to take it by themselves and recover at home, it'll just save them the burden um, of having to receive emergency care. And also, the longer a patient has a seizure, it's the worse for their brain and their life overall. Like there's more brain damage if those seizures go longer.
So it's best to keep it as short as possible.
Yeah.
Um, so that pretty much wraps up the questions about the specific epilepsy. Um, but to branch off a little bit about like the general company that you're working for, which is UCB. So as a medical director there, what is your primary role within the company?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of medical directors at UCB. Yeah, there's not a single medical director, and even within my department, there's many medical directors. Um, the medical director role in um, my department is called Global Clinical Development, and within that, I'm in the neurology team. And so the medical directors in this global clinical development department are responsible for overseeing clinical trials in the late stages. So there's four phases of research in humans. There's a phase one, two, three, and four. Um, I work primarily on phase three right now, and that's the last phase before drug approval. Phase four might be some drug testing after a drug is approved and on the market. And so some of the other medical directors also work on phase four. But I primarily work on the phase three larger trials. And so that involves um, three parts. One is setting up a clinical trial, then running the clinical trial, and then lastly, analyzing all the results and publishing it. So it's a you get to do a lot of different things in different times. There's we work with a lot of we don't do this by ourselves. It's a team effort, and we work a lot with partner companies as well. There's people at UCB, and then we have outsourced partners, and it's just getting the clinical trials done, and our goal is to make medicines available for our patients.
Oh, so just to clarify, like phase one and two would be like the drug development, is that?
So phase one and two are with another department, our early phase department,
Mhm.
um, and so I can go briefly over the different phases. So phase one is the first in human. You may start in a very small population, maybe 10 to 20 patients, sometimes more. And a lot of times these are in healthy volunteers. And so they take the drug in very small doses based on knowledge of what you have from the animal studies, and you give it like a little dose to a patient or to a healthy volunteer. And then you give a little bit more to another, just basically to see what's the lowest, what's a safe dose for patients in general. And then phase two, you take that safe dose. Um, there's a balance between like you might want you need to give enough that they'll do something, but you don't want to give too much because it might be unsafe. But phase two is where you try that drug in the patient population. And so like phase one, which healthy volunteers, phase two might be with patients with epilepsy, but you just do a small proof of concept study. So you do maybe 60 patients or something like that. And just to see, okay, will this does this have a potential of working? And then um, once that happens, then you go to phase three and you scale up. So the current study that I'm working on is in 12 countries. We have about 150 sites, research sites, 150 doctors working on the protocol that I developed. And it's a lot bigger. We're trying to recruit about um, about 250 patients, um, and it's it's a few years versus like a year. It's longer in duration as well.
So, just like one last supplemental question. So, what percentage of drugs usually make it to phase three?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I don't know. I can't give a good answer, but a lot of them don't. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, it also depends on how well drugs are selected, and how risky the company is in bringing a drug to phase three, because you could take a chance, um, or some companies are more like willing to take a higher chance than others. So there's a lot of factors, but there's a lot of them don't make it. It's like they fail or they fail in phase three as like Pat 7 wasn't as the super drug that we had hoped.
Oh, so it like all depends on company protocols too.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Um, so I want to ask a little bit more deeper. as you work as a medical director, what are some parts of your job that you would say that's most difficult or frustrating?
Difficult and frustrating. Well, it sounds similar, they're different to me. So, what is difficult is a lot of times um, in our company, and I think a lot of companies, we try to align a lot of the like there's different departments, there's different interests, not just our like the department. There's different teams, and there's external stakeholders. There's a lot of people, um, and the patients, of course, are one of them. But we need to align all the people's interest and in our ultimate goal to bring these medicines to patients. Um, and so there's pressures from all sorts of fronts. There's financial pressures. Someone needs to fund this research, pay everyone. Even there's things like even paying the patient to reimbursing for transportation and their time, et cetera. So there's a lot of different pressures like and so it's getting alignment within the teams and externally, trying to figure out what is the a good amount of data to collect, what data is important, aligning that with the FDA as well, because if you don't get enough data, then it's not going to the drug's not going to be approved.
Mm.
If you get too much data, then patients are not happy or the doctors aren't happy. They have to spend so much time collecting all this information. Um, so that's one of the challenging things, just trying to get a good balance. And there may be, it's like, yeah, it would be, um, let's say you have a drug, like I guess the most safe way to test the drug is to get a patient to stay in the hospital with the doctor for a year or something, right? And take every day. But you're not going to do that. That doesn't make sense. Um, Especially if you're intending for that drug to be used in the outpatient setting at home. And so you can't, it's like, how often do you want them to come into the clinic? They have to get test them done, and how, like their blood draw, or like how to, what can you do from their home? Can they record some information from their house and send it? And there's a lot of challenges. So that's one of the difficult things about um, the 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 work. Um,
Mm.
yeah, there's there's always challenges in this line of work. I'm sure in every field as well.
So basically making everyone happy and the little details.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So we're almost at the end of the interview, but if I could ask one more question about like the path you've come to become like a researcher. So if you can name like a specific experience or a specific like opportunity that you got to have within your time in like medical school or within your time getting your PhD, or it doesn't really matter, but if you could name one of those, but what would you say is like the most significant to the to contributing to who you are today, basically?
Okay, to who I am today, I think one of the most I guess going through when I went to college, I was interested in research. I did undergraduate research and spent time in the chemistry lab. I was thinking initially about being a computational biochemistry scientist, and then I decided to pursue medical research later. I realized there was this MD PhD program where I can do research and medicine at the same time, and it was a combined graduate training. Um, and the goal of the training is to have physicians, be able to see patients, and then also um, do research, and also if they're at the university setting, teach next generation. And it seemed like a great. I mean, it's really it seems like a really neat idea, and that's what I really wanted to do. When I went into the MD PhD program, I just really I so it was there's two the way that the traditional MD PhD program is set up is there's 2 years of medical school, then a PhD, and then 2 years the last 2 years of medical school. Um, and then during the summers, during the medical school part, then you can do additional PhD training as well. So it's sort of overlapping. Some of the classes are exactly the same, and so you get credit and it streamlines it, doing it at once. I did my MD and then I did my PhD, and it was in a clinical and translational research center. So I was able to work with patients with diabetes, and we were trying to, in a sense, make a breathalyzer for diabetics, so they don't have to prick themselves, and they can see if they can measure the blood sugar and insulin and lipids um, through their breath. So it was a really neat project, and I was stoked about doing research, and I thought, okay, this is really cool. And so I had that experience behind my belt. I went into the last 2 years of medical school, which is the clinical research part. I went to see patients, um, and I thought this is kind of neat too. But I really like that clinical research part better. And I heard a talk to and listened to another person explain that he decided to go into medical research, even though he was a physician, because as a physician, he can see maybe 1,000 patients or a few thousand patients in his life. But if he makes some breakthrough in medical research, he could help millions just through the discovery. And so that stuck with me, and I thought, yeah, let's do this clinical research thing. And so that's ultimately how I chose this path, and one job led to another, and ultimately I ended up at UCB.
Thank you so much for answering the questions. So that does mark the end of the interview. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll be happy to share this with the rest of the class.
All right, great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.